Steve Harvey had seen almost everything in his 15 years of hosting Family Feud. The laughter, the tears, the outrageous answers that made him throw his cue cards. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened that Tuesday afternoon in October. When 95-year-old Walter Jenkins stepped forward during Fast Money, no one expected the frail World War II veteran to share a story that would leave the entire studio frozen in disbelief. When Walter revealed what his wife Margaret had done just days before she passed away, even the unflappable Steve Harvey couldn't maintain his composure. The moment that followed would become one of the most profound in television history, proving that some truths are too powerful for even the brightest studio lights. Walter Jenkins was 95 years old. For nearly 7 decades, he had built a life with his wife Margaret in their modest home in Maplewood, Missouri. Now spotted with age and trembling slightly, had once helped build B-17 bombers during World War II before returning home to work 30 years at the local steel mill. Those same hands had held Margaret's through cancer treatments, the birth of their 4 children, and the loss of their youngest son in Vietnam. The Jenkins family had come on Family Feud as part of a special Veterans Week episode, with Walter joining his granddaughter Emily, her husband, and 2 of their adult children. Walter hadn't planned to participate actively. He was just happy to be surrounded by family and fulfill Margaret's lifelong wish to see a television show taping. But when Emily's husband developed sudden back pain minutes before filming, Walter had quietly volunteered to take his place. "I might be old, but I'm not useless," he had told his worried granddaughter. "Your grandmother would have wanted me to help." What the audience didn't know, what even his family didn't fully understand, was that Walter was carrying a weight far heavier than his years. Just 4 months earlier, Margaret had passed away at 93, ending their 68-year marriage. What Walter hadn't shared with anyone was what happened in their final week together, and the promise he had made beside her hospital bed. A promise he was now, unexpectedly, in a position to fulfill on national television. As Walter stood at the Fast Money podium, Steve noticed something unusual. Most contestants fidgeted nervously or bounced with excitement, but Walter stood perfectly still, one hand resting on what appeared to be an old, folded letter in his breast pocket. His eyes held not the confusion or disorientation that sometimes came with advanced age, but rather an intense clarity of purpose that made Steve pause. "You ready for this, Mr. Jenkins?" Steve asked, his voice instinctively softening with respect. Walter nodded, his voice steady despite his years. "I've been ready for this my whole life, son. More than you know." The Jenkins family had already won the main game, with Walter surprising everyone by providing 2 of the winning answers despite his age. Now it was time for Fast Money, and Emily had gone first, scoring an impressive 58 points. Walter needed just 42 points to win the $20,000 prize for his family. 20 seconds on the clock, Steve announced as Walter took his position. "Name something people are afraid to do as they get older." "Drive at night." Walter answered without hesitation. "Name a place where you might find an umbrella stand entryway." "Name something you hang on a wall." "Photographs." "Name a reason someone might wake up at 3 a.m. bad dreams." "Name a famous mouse." "Mickey," Walter said as the buzzer sounded. The audience applauded politely, but there was tension in the air. Walter had seemed distracted during the last 2 questions, his eyes drifting toward the letter in his pocket. As Steve prepared to reveal the scores, Walter suddenly raised his hand. "Mr. Harvey," Walter said, his voice suddenly stronger, "before you show those answers, I need to say something." Steve looked momentarily confused but nodded. "Of course, sir. Take your time." Walter pulled the letter from his pocket, his hands trembling more noticeably now. "My Margaret, my wife of 68 years, she passed away 4 months ago." A sympathetic murmur swept through the audience. "In our last week together, she made me promise something." Walter unfolded the letter carefully. "You see, Margaret and I watched Family Feud every night. For years she'd say, 'Walter, we should go on that show.' I always told her we were too old, that it wasn't for people like us." Walter's voice cracked slightly, but he continued. 3 days before she passed, she asked for a pen and paper. She was so weak she could barely write, but she made this list." He held up the letter, now visibly a list of 5 items in shaky handwriting. "She said, 'Walter, I figured out the answers to Fast Money. If you ever get on that show, these will win it.'" The studio had fallen completely silent. Steve stood motionless, his usual animation replaced by rapt attention. "I laughed and told her she was being silly," Walter continued, "but she made me promise. She made me swear that somehow, someday, I'd try these answers on the show. I never thought it would happen, but when my granddaughter got the call and then her husband hurt his back, I knew Margaret was giving me one last chance to keep my promise." Walter looked down at the paper in his hands, now trembling visibly. "The truth is, Mr. Harvey, I didn't use Margaret's answers just now. I was too afraid of letting her down, of looking foolish if they were wrong. I used my own answers instead." He looked directly at Steve, his eyes now filled with tears. "I failed her, Mr. Harvey. In our final moments together, she asked just one thing of me, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't trust her enough to keep my promise." The studio was absolutely silent. Steve Harvey stood frozen, the scoring cards forgotten in his hands. After nearly 20 seconds of complete stillness, an eternity in television time, Steve slowly walked over to Walter. "Sir," Steve said quietly, "may I see that list?" Walter handed over Margaret's letter with trembling hands. Steve studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he set the fast money scoring cards face down on his podium, removed his earpiece, and walked off stage. The audience gasped. The producers began frantically speaking into their headsets. Walter stood alone at the podium, confusion and distress evident on his weathered face. For nearly 2 full minutes, an unprecedented break in filming, the stage remained empty except for the 95-year-old veteran, standing uncertainly with his wife's last wish clutched in his hand. Then Steve returned, but not alone. Behind him walked the show's executive producer, 2 production assistants, and a legal representative, all looking solemn. Steve approached Walter and took both of the elderly man's hands in his own. "Mr. Jenkins," Steve said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent studio, "in 15 years hosting this show, I've never done what I'm about to do." He turned to address the audience and cameras directly. "Family Feud has strict rules. Contestants must give their own answers. We protect the integrity of the game. That's how it works." Looking back at Walter. "But some things are more important than rules." Steve turned to the executive producer, who nodded solemnly. "We're gonna do something unprecedented," Steve announced. "With permission from our producers and standards department, we're gonna honor Mrs. Jenkins' last wish." Steve carefully took Margaret's list and walked back to his position. "Mr. Jenkins, we're going to replay your round of fast money. But this time, I want you to give me exactly what Margaret wrote on this paper, in the order she wrote it. Can you do that?" Walter's eyes widened in disbelief. "You'd do that? But the rules?" Steve shook his head. "Some promises transcend our rules, sir. This is one of them." The audience burst into applause as the production assistants reset the board. Walter stood straighter now, a burden visibly lifting from his shoulders. 20 seconds on the clock, Steve announced again. "Name something people are afraid to do as they get older." Looking at Margaret's list, Walter replied clearly, "Drive a car." "Name a place where you might find an umbrella stand." "By the front door." "Name something you hang on a wall." "Family portraits." "Name a reason someone might wake up at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom." "Name a famous mouse." "Mickey Mouse." Walter finished just as the buzzer sounded. Steve looked down at the original fast money cards, then at Margaret's list, his expression inscrutable. The studio was hushed in anticipation. "Mr. Jenkins," Steve finally said, "your first answer of a car survey said," the board revealed, 42 points. "But the front door, as where you'd find an umbrella stand, 29 points. Family portraits for something you hang on a wall, 35 points. To use the bathroom for why someone might wake up at 3 a.m., 1 points. The running total was already 147 points. With Emily's 158, but there was still one answer left. And for a famous mouse, you said Mickey Mouse." Survey said. The board revealed 45 points. The studio erupted. Walter had scored 192 points alone, a near-perfect round. Combined with Emily's score, the Jenkins family had achieved 350 points, one of the highest fast money scores in the show's history. But Steve wasn't looking at the scoreboard. He was watching Walter, who had sunk to his knees, clutching Margaret's letter to his heart, tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "She knew," Walter whispered. After all those years of watching, she knew exactly what to say. As the initial applause began to fade, the magnitude of what had just happened settled over the studio. Production assistants were wiping tears from their eyes. Camera operators were trying to maintain their composure. The Jenkins family stood in shock, witnessing their patriarch's moment of vindication. Steve knelt down beside Walter, placing a supportive hand on the elderly man's shoulder. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't part of the game show formula. But in that moment, Steve Harvey wasn't a host. He was simply a human being connecting with another's profound grief and redemption. "Tell me about her, Mr. Jenkins," Steve said quietly, but the microphones caught every word. Walter took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We met at Pearl Harbor, December 5, 1941. 2 days before the attack, I was a young sailor, just 19. She was a nurse, 21 years old, with the brightest smile I'd ever seen." The audience listened in reverent silence as Walter continued. "After the attack, everything was chaos. I was pulling people from the water, and suddenly there she was again, covered in soot and blood, still helping everyone she could. We found each other in all that destruction, and I knew right then I'd never let her go." Steve helped Walter back to his feet. "And you never did." 68 years, Walter nodded. "Not all of them easy." "What was her secret?" Steve asked. "How did she know the right answers after all these years?" Walter smiled through his tears. "Margaret always said the secret to our marriage was that we actually watched each other, not just lived side by side. She knew what I would say, and she knew what most people would say. That's how she figured out the game, by really paying attention to people." Steve turned to the audience. "I think we all just got a master class in marriage from Mrs. Margaret Jenkins." The applause was thunderous. But Walter wasn't finished. "There's more to her letter," he said, unfolding another section that had remained hidden. "She wrote, 'Walter, when you win, because I know you will. I want you to do something we never got to do. Take our family to Pearl Harbor. Show them where our story began. Show them the exact spot where you first asked for my name." Walter's voice broke. "We talked about it for decades, but there was never enough money, never enough time. Always next year," we said. Then suddenly, there weren't any next years left. Steve looked at the executive producer, who was already nodding before Steve could even ask the question. "Mr. Jenkins," Steve said, his voice strong with emotion, "Family Feud would be honored to send your entire family to Pearl Harbor. Not just with your winnings, but as our guests, every expense covered. A private tour. Whatever it takes to fulfill that promise to Margaret." The studio erupted again, but Walter seemed lost in memory. "She always knew," he said softly. "Even at the end, she knew exactly how to take care of me." The cameras caught Emily, Walter's granddaughter, approaching slowly. "Grandpa," she said gently, "is that why you insisted on wearing Grandma's wedding ring on that chain around your neck today? Did you know this might happen?" Walter touched the small gold band that hung beneath his shirt. He said simply. "Somehow she made sure she was." What happened next wasn't planned, wasn't scripted, and had never occurred in 15 seasons of Family Feud. Steve Harvey, overcome with emotion, had to remove his signature glasses and wipe his eyes. Then, in an unprecedented break with game show protocol, he embraced Walter Jenkins in a hug that lasted nearly 30 seconds, neither man speaking, both understanding that some moments transcend words. When Steve finally stepped back, his usual jovial demeanor was replaced by something more solemn. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the cameras, "we'll return after these messages. But before we go, I want to say something. What we've witnessed here today isn't about a game show. It's about a love that survived a world war, raised 4 children, endured the loss of a son, and even now, even after death, continues to provide guidance and care. That's what commitment looks like. That's what love really means." As the show went to commercial break, Steve kept his arm around Walter's shoulders, guiding him back to his family, united in grief, joy, and astonishment at Margaret's final gift to them all. 6 weeks after the episode aired, Steve Harvey stood on the shores of Pearl Harbor at dawn. Beside him stood Walter Jenkins and 3 generations of his family. 16 people in all, from Walter's 70-year-old daughter to his 4-year-old great-granddaughter. The Family Feud episode had become a phenomenon unlike anything the show had seen before. Over 30 million viewers had watched the initial broadcast, with clips of Walter's moment reaching hundreds of millions more online. Letters and emails poured into the network by the thousands, many from elderly couples sharing their own stories of promises kept and broken. But here, away from the cameras and public attention, something more intimate and profound was unfolding. "This is where I was standing," Walter said, pointing to a specific spot near the memorial. "December 5, 1941. I was just a boy from Missouri who'd never seen the ocean before joining the Navy. I was homesick and scared, though I wouldn't admit it to anyone." His family gathered around him, listening intently as he continued. The nurses' quarters were just over there. Margaret was walking with 2 other nurses. They were laughing about something. She had this red ribbon in her hair. Walter's voice softened at the memory. "When she smiled, it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I forgot to be scared. I forgot to be homesick. I just knew I had to talk to her." Steve watched as Walter's great-grandchildren stared up at him in wonder, perhaps truly seeing him as a young man for the first time, not just as their elderly great-grandfather. "What did you say to her?" asked Emily. Walter chuckled. "Nothing clever. I just asked Miss, could you tell me how to find the mess hall?" She knew I was lying. The mess hall was the biggest building around. Nobody could miss it. But she played along, gave me directions like I really needed them. Then she said, "If you're still lost at dinner time, I'm off duty at 6. Walter led his family a few yards away. "Right here, this exact spot. This is where I was standing when the attack began the next morning. The world exploded around us. Men were shouting. Planes diving. I was frozen with fear until I saw nurses running toward the harbor, not away from it, and there she was again. Margaret, running toward danger to help however she could." He knelt down, slowly but deliberately, and placed a single white rose on the ground. "We found each other that evening among all the injured and dying. She was exhausted, covered in other people's blood, but still working. I brought her water, helped her any way I could. When she finally took a break, we sat right here as the sun was setting over the burning harbor. That's when we made our first promise to each other." Walter's daughter stepped forward. "What promise, Dad? You never told us this part." "We promised that if we survived, we would come back here someday, together, to remember not just the horror of that day, but to celebrate finding each other amid all that destruction." Walter's voice trembled. "I never kept that promise, and she never, not once in 68 years, complained about it. That was Margaret, always putting everyone else first." Steve Harvey, who had remained respectfully silent, finally spoke. "But you're here now, Mr. Jenkins. You kept your promise." Walter nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Better late than never," she always said. That evening, the Jenkins family gathered in a private room at a local restaurant. Steve had arranged for a cake to celebrate Walter and Margaret's wedding anniversary. A date that would have marked 70 years if she had lived just 2 more months. As Walter prepared to cut the cake, he paused, looking around at his assembled family. Margaret knew she was dying, he said quietly. Those last weeks she was putting everything in order, making sure I would be taken care of. That list, those game show answers, it wasn't really about winning money. It was about making sure I would bring all of you here, to understand where we came from. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Margaret's letter, now carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. There's a part of this letter I haven't shared yet, he said. The part she wrote just for all of you. Walter handed the letter to Emily, who unfolded it with trembling hands and began to read. To my beloved family, if Walter has read this, then something remarkable has happened. You've gone on our favorite show and hopefully, you've won. More importantly, you're now in Hawaii, at the place where your family's story truly began. I have one request for each of you. Find love like Walter and I found. Not the easy kind that comes when everything is perfect, but the kind that survives war and loss, financial struggles and heartbreak, the kind that grows stronger through hardship. Remember that promises matter, even small ones, even ones that take a lifetime to fulfill. Especially those. And finally, don't wait. Don't say someday or next year for the things that matter most. Walter and I had a beautiful life with only one regret, that we postponed so many dreams thinking time was endless. Time is not endless, it is precious. Use it to keep your promises to each other. With eternal love, Margaret. The room fell silent as Emily finished reading. Steve Harvey, who had seen almost everything in his years on television, found himself once again deeply moved by Margaret's foresight and wisdom. Walter stood a little straighter, his voice steady despite his tears. Tomorrow we're going to the exact spot where I proposed to her, 3 years after Pearl Harbor. I'm going to show you the banyan tree where we carved our initials. It's still there, I checked. And then we're going to create some new memories, to add to the ones Margaret and I made all those years ago. The story of Walter and Margaret Jenkins continued to spread in the months that followed. Their episode of Family Feud remained the most watched in the show's history. But the impact extended far beyond television ratings. The Veterans Administration reported a significant increase in elderly veterans making pilgrimages to meaningful sites from their service years, often bringing multiple generations of their families along. They called it the Jenkins effect. The recognition that sharing these historical connections with family was a precious gift that couldn't wait for someday. The Walter and Margaret Jenkins Foundation, established with donations that forward the game show's 20,000 prize, began providing travel grants for elderly veterans and their families. Within its first year, the foundation helped over 200 families fulfill similar promises. Retirement communities across the country organized promise fulfillment programs, helping residents identify and accomplish the meaningful commitments they had postponed. One nursing home director told reporters, after the Jenkins story aired, "Our residents started talking openly about their unfulfilled promises. It was like a dam broke. Now we're helping them keep those promises while they still can." Marriage counselors and therapists incorporated the story into their practices, using Walter and Margaret's lifelong commitment as a teaching tool about trust, patience, and the importance of truly seeing one's partner. On the 1-year anniversary of the episode's airing, Steve Harvey invited Walter back to Family Feud. Now 96, Walter entered to a standing ovation from the studio audience. "Last year," Steve told the viewers, "a 95-year-old man taught us all something profound about love and commitment. Today, we're honored to announce a permanent change to our show." Steve revealed that Family Feud would now include an annual Margaret Jenkins Memorial episode during Veterans Week, with all winnings doubled and matched with donations to the Jenkins Foundation. "But that's not all," Steve continued. "We're also introducing a new tradition. At the end of each Veterans Week episode, we'll ask one special bonus question." He turned to Walter. "Would you like to tell them what that question is, sir?" Walter smiled, his eyes bright with emotion. "Name something worth waiting a lifetime for." According to the survey results, the top answers were true love, family, peace of mind, finding your purpose, and keeping a promise. Walter nodded approvingly at the board. Margaret would have gotten them all right. In the 3 years that followed, Walter Jenkins became an unexpected cultural icon. He was invited to speak at military academies, universities, and even the United Nations International Day of Older Persons. His message was always the same: love isn't just about grand gestures, it's about the promises we keep, especially when keeping them is difficult. Walter lived to celebrate his 100th birthday, surrounded by a family that now included 4 new great-grandchildren, one of whom, a baby girl named Margaret, was born on Pearl Harbor Day. In his final months, Walter worked with historians to document his and Margaret's wartime experiences for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. The handwritten list of game show answers became part of the Smithsonian's exhibition on American popular culture, displayed alongside items representing pivotal moments in television history. On Walter's 100th birthday, Steve Harvey presented him with a leather-bound book containing over 10,000 letters from people who have been inspired by his story to fulfill their own postponed promises. The book's title, embossed in gold on the cover, reads simply, "Better late than never, promises kept because of Walter and Margaret." Walter Jenkins passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months later. At his funeral, attended by hundreds including Steve Harvey and the entire production team from Family Feud, his granddaughter Emily shared a final discovery. After Grandpa returned from Pearl Harbor last year, he started writing letters to Grandma, telling her about our trip and everything that had happened since she passed away. We found them in his desk, each one dated and sealed. Emily held up a bundle of envelopes. The last one, written just 2 days before he died, ended with these words: "Margaret, I kept my promise. All of them, finally. I'll be seeing you soon, my love, and this time, I won't be late." The story of Walter and Margaret Jenkins ultimately transcended its game show origins to become a powerful reminder of the enduring nature of love, the importance of kept promises, and the unexpected ways we find meaning in our final acts of devotion to those we've loved for a lifetime. As Steve Harvey would later remark in his autobiography, in an entertainment industry focused on flash and novelty, Walter and Margaret Jenkins reminded us all that the most compelling stories are often the simplest: a promise made, a promise kept, and a love that continues to guide us even after one journey ends and another begins.